The first is last week, the BRICS summit that was held in Russia. This was lauded as a diplomatic or at least symbolic victory for Putin and Russia and just their international recognition. But why don't you give us kind of your general reaction to the success of BRICS leading up to this summit that took place last week?
Well, BRICS is a very odd phenomenon because it is a loosely organized international coalition of some sort. I mean, I say it's coalition is a would-be coalition even. Only international groupings, you must have common values. I mean, I don't say common value among the 5 countries, the core countries, Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. I mean, of course, now it's expanded its membership to include Iran and several other countries. So
Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE, that's who was added this year.
So it's very hard to say what it is. I think the founding members, China and Russia in particular, had in mind that this is going to be either or international organization. Basically, it's basically anti-West in its intention. But most of the countries in this BRICS group does not want to declare either or. Rather, most of them are sitting on the fence.
Right.
So they want to benefit from both the Western Alliance and also the BRICS Alliance. That's why it's a loosely organized coalition without a common value to defend. So it's very hard to say it's a really security alliance. It's far, far away from the likes of NATO. But you say, well, there may be common interest. Not really. I mean, what's the common interest? And from Russia and China's point of view, they want to upend the international order. But if the international order as it is over, would that really benefit countries like Brazil, India, or even South Africa? So even China, I would say, because China benefits tremendously from the existing international order. The only difference is that China wants to replace its own communist command economy as its own model of governance with the international order as it is. So I don't know whether China is going to succeed in that way or even benefit from that. So it's hard to say they have common interest. Well, you'd say, is it a trade bloc or it's based upon economic interest? It's hard to say because the preponderance of the power of market and technology is in the West. Is not within the BRICS.
Yeah.
So that's why it's not necessarily a trading bloc. And then maybe say, well, maybe they want to create a common currency. Yes, China tried to use yuan to replace the US dollar as the ultimate international settlement currency or reserve currency. The problem with that is yuan is not convertible because it's controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. It's not a market floating. So what do you do with the money that can only be used in China? So nobody really wants it. I mean, countries like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, they get the Chinese money. Do you know what they do? They go to Hong Kong, exchange to US dollars immediately, or buy gold from Shanghai gold market. So they want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The interesting thing is Brazil has a very robust trade with China. China wants Brazil to use yuan. Brazilians say, not really. Let's just do the most primitive way of trading, barter. In other words, I buy your stuff, you buy my stuff. So what the Brazil wants? Well, they get a lot of Huawei stuff, the electronics, infrastructure. So Huawei ended up having a lot of Brazilian beef. Huawei, the electronics giant in China is now the biggest Brazilian beef merchant in China because they have to sell this kind of stuff. So it's a very weird entity. So BRICS is a mystery to a lot of people. I don't see any bright future in the near term.
It feels very symbolic at best. I do think one of the interesting photo ops was when you talk about replacement currency, they did roll out an example banknote, a BRICS banknote, which I did like the design of, but don't love the concept. But did anything actually come out of this meeting?
Very little. I mean, it looks like a kumbaya, looks like a big powwow.
Yeah.
of a new G7 or something, what do you call it, grouping. Basically, BRICS is designed as a counterweight against the G7.
Yeah.
But it's not really necessarily a big victory, despite all the pageantry and pomposity in Kazakh and Russia. On the other hand, what this big powwow in Russia really is a sign of BRICS in crisis, because Putin cannot go to a lot of countries because he's wanted the international war criminal. So that's why in the previous BRICS summit, Putin couldn't go to South Africa. Putin couldn't go to India for the BRICS summit. And South Africa summit, because Putin's absence, Xi Jinping was not very happy. So basically he stayed there halfway and then left. And the next summit was somewhere, hosted by India. I believe that's not necessarily BRICS, G20, I think. Xi Jinping refused to go because Putin couldn't go. So the reason why there's so much noise, so much feigned joys in Kazakh and Russia last week was because everyone is happy to go to Russia to avoid the embarrassment of their home country becoming global pariah for hosting Putin without arresting him.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it does sound like a victory for Putin, at least in terms of reputational gain.
Right.
Because it does serve to legitimize Putin. I mean, I think what's really, really most bizarre is not all the member countries' leaders win. It's the head of the UN. Secretary General Guterres showed up for the hoopla. That was basically, I think, a disgrace. This is the international war criminal, the biggest destroyer of global peace. And the head of the UN showed up to congratulate, to add his own prestige to this bizarre and absurd summit. UN should be ashamed of itself.
Outside of Russia, who obviously has a vested interest in the success of this particular BRICS summit, what about countries like China, obviously, who's the focus of the show, but India, I think, is an interesting member in BRICS. They've kind of got one toe over here in the West, and they've got one toe in BRICS. So what are China and India looking to get out of a meeting like this, and maybe BRICS in general?
Okay, there are two major issues at this summit that were discussed. Number one is the expansion of membership. Another one is war in Ukraine. So you kind of go to Russia, we are talking about the war in Ukraine. So let's talk about the expanding membership. India is a very curious member in that grouping, because India has a lot of self-interest, its own very quirky perspective on global security. And one of the most earnest applicants for the new BRICS membership is Turkey.
Yeah.
And Turkey is very close to Pakistan. So India really hates the idea of Turkey becoming a member of the BRICS. So India basically blocked Turkey's application for joining the BRICS. And this is basically, so this didn't go anywhere. Now, on war in Ukraine, it's very, very interesting, also kind of a fake, because China, Brazil has some kind of proposal for peace in Ukraine. India also urged Vladimir Putin to consider peace. But then all these BRICS countries, they have no backbone, because they all say they want peace without condemning the aggression, without condemning the destroyer of peace, that is Vladimir Putin. So this all looks very hypocritical to me. That's why the discussion of war in Ukraine, and particularly urging an appeal for peace in Ukraine, sounds very surreal, a little bit Kafkaesque.
I like how you're highlighting Turkey's membership there. I think there's a couple dichotomies there, not just their opposition to India, but also that they're a NATO member. It would be joining BRICS. So there's a lot of crisscrossing ideas and values here that when you talk about finding a central value system to unite all of BRICS, it just gets more complicated the more they bring people in.
I think if Turkey joins the BRICS or any other international security alliances, even though BRICS is not one, but it has the potential to become one.
No, but
then if Turkey does that, you run the risk of Turkey being kicked out of NATO, because you must have a weapons integration. You must have a critical infrastructure, communication. Unity of defense infrastructure is a requirement for membership in the NATO. And I think if Turkey joins the other security alliances with NATO as its primary enemy, and that will basically make Turkey's membership in great question.
Yeah. All right. Well, shifting back to China and India, last week they settled on an agreement on their border dispute in the Himalayas. I'd like you to give us some more details on this, Miles. Is this an agreement on the actual borders, or is this an agreement on patrols around the border?
I think China wants to say this is basically on joint peaceful patrol of the border line. But in reality, China basically ceded the disputed territory to India, something like 2.5 times bigger than the size of Taiwan. So China basically treated all the territorial disputes as a geopolitical bargaining game. It has nothing to do with China's vowed determination to uphold territorial integrity. If that's the case, they would basically not have dealt issues like this with such a cavalier attitude. I mean, today I'm your enemy. Tomorrow I'll give you whatever you want. And so that's basically it shows China's hypocritical nature of demanding annexation of Taiwan. China always said this has everything to do with upholding motherland's territorial integrity. That's pure nonsense. Look at this. This is basically another thing. And India immediately declared the establishment of a new administrative infrastructure over that territory that China just ceded. So it's pretty much like that. Now, this is actually very interesting. This is not the first time China has done this. China has ceded its territories, was supposed to be Chinese territory, to many countries that China considered as ideological allies, to the former Soviet Union, to former communist Mongolia, even to today's North Korea. They had the border agreement in 1962, which is still, is in effect. India and China did not have a border dispute of any kind for 10 years, between 1949 and 1959. There's some different understanding of the previous border agreement signed between British India and the Chinese government, as well as the Tibetan government at the time. But nevertheless, it was not mounting to a crisis until 1959, when Dalai Lama went to India and Indian government granted Dalai Lama a sanctuary. Right. That has been the problem. And also, particularly since India clearly took the side with the Soviet Union in this very nasty internecine communist fight for global leadership between the Soviet Union and China in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So that's why China used this border issue as an excuse. Manufacturing created a problem, and so went to war with India in 1962, and which China crushed Indian defenders. So but that sort of a memory has never faded in the minds of India high command, and also in general population. And then in recent years, India has risen quite dramatically, economically, technologically, and militarily. So China view India as a destabilizing factor, particularly considering its connection with the Tibetans. So China and India has gone pretty much like nuts over the border issue, and they're very tense, and leading to the tragic incident in June 2020, where Chinese border guards plunging to death something like 24 Indian soldiers. Yeah. So that's why the two countries was on a sort of in bad blood for a while, and now Xi Jinping needed India for the sake of the BRICS anti-West alliance, and so that's why he basically conceded. And this has
I was going to say that the timing is no coincidence here. The agreement was settled, I think, a day or two before this BRICS summit was held. So what ultimately led to, I think that kind of answers to why now, but there's a lot of history here. Why would Xi Jinping just cede that much territory?
Well, because India is a big country, as I say, India has a growing relationship with the West, particularly with the United States. So for purely geopolitical expediency, China needs India's good grace. Because India is playing a very decisive role in many international arenas. Chinese Communist Party is partly influenced by the communist ideology when it comes to that shape its a grand strategy, but also is influenced deeply by Chinese sort of traditional, historical, strategic wisdom that has come from the warring states age. I mean, basically, it's emphasized on opportunistic expediency and deception. In this case, China and India may be on good terms right now, but China has never given up its own containment policy against India that has been going on for decades. China remains the biggest backer of Pakistan government. Pakistan and India have never get along since 1948.
Right.
And China has a robustly beefed up India's adversaries along its periphery. I mean, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal, you name it. China has spent a lot of money in those countries, basically to what China called containment against India. So I would not say this is as the ultimate détente. I think it's just,
It's opportunistic.
Absolutely. It's temporary. Any moment, there's kind of tension.
Until they shift focus back and the borders get fluid again.
That's right.
Your argument is probably that this is not going to last, or it is going to last until it doesn't need to anymore.
Listen, this border issue between China and India has been going on since 1962. That's over 60-some years ago. Mm-hmm. And they have so many rounds of border negotiations to no avail. Every time there was a negotiation, China always tried to create some kind of tension. This is China's grand strategy, which is summed up by the former Chinese Communist Party chief Jiang Zemin as 以对抗求合作, to use confrontation to coerce cooperation. That's why China is such a destabilizing factor, not just along Indian-China border. In the whole global security environment, China's approach is always try to make trouble to become a big jerk, as big as possible, so that other people will be scared of it and to make some concession to it. This is basically Hitler logic.
Well, there's an agreement, but only history will tell if the border is actually settled. So that brings us to our final topic, and that is Taiwanese President Lai paying a visit to the island of Quemoy to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Guningtou. Could you just give us a brief history of the battle, why it's such a big deal, what it represents for the Taiwanese legacy now, and why it's such a big deal that President Lai went there and visited in this moment?
Well, the Battle of Guningtou, also known as the Battle of Quemoy, took place between October 25th and October 27th or 28th. It depends on how you counted that. So for a matter of several days, the battle was very intense. It was over the Chinese invasion of the little tiny island of Quemoy, also known as Kinmen, which was several kilometers away from Chinese mainland coast. This took place in the backdrop of this massive retreat or defeat of the KMT, the Chinese nationalist government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, in the hands of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And that Battle of Quemoy was an amphibious battle. It was the largest amphibious battle the People's Liberation Army has ever fought since then. But the battle was won by the KMT, by the defenders, decisively. 3 regiments, up to 10,000 Chinese troops were annihilated. And this was a brilliant battle, and it was a very pivotal battle because it stopped the momentum of the Chinese communist military advance toward Taiwan. So they existing.
You just quickly. You sent me a report by the Naval War College, and I love how they put it. They said this was the battle that saved the Republic of China. It was Chiang Kai-shek's Battle of Midway, turning the tide of history.
That was so well phrased, and I fully endorse that because I wrote that article.
Of course you did.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you didn't see the author.
I didn't even see it. That's wonderful.
This is a little short article I wrote for the U.S. Naval War College Review a few years back. It's just a battle analysis of why the Chinese Communist Party lost this battle. It's pretty pivotal because this settled the current pattern of balance of power across the Taiwan Strait. It stopped the communist advance. And it preserved the offshore islands of Kinmen and Matsu from being taken by the Chinese communists. And then, most importantly, it prevented the Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan. Most importantly, as a matter of fact, if you look at the archived evidence of the U.S. military, it actually was the battle that convinced the American Joint Chief of Staff that the Nationalist Party actually could win a battle on such such critical moment. It changed American military's outlook and their assessment about capability of the KMT. So, which is really important. If you want to be really a little bit sort of dramatic, you might say this is actually a battle of Saratoga. For the Taiwanese. You know, in October 1777, George Washington's ragtag army defeated the British army, the strongest military force in the world, in Saratoga, New York. That single battle convinced the French and the Spanish, who hated the British, to finally sort of jump the ship and and sign an official alliance with George Washington and the Continental Congress. So I mentioned about Midway turning the point, but it's probably more appropriate to use this as the Battle of the Saratoga that convinced America, hey, listen, the KMT, they actually could hold on, and that has become a pivotal battle for the survival of Taiwan as we know it. And then, of course, it's called Republic of China under the KMT leadership. And the most fascinating part of this is that President William Lai Ching-te, paid a visit to that island to specifically commemorate the 70th anniversary of the battle at guningtou. This is so important politically for Taiwan because Lai Ching-te has come from exactly the opposite of the KMT. So he went there to pay tribute to the sacrifice of the KMT soldiers for the survival of Taiwan. He said, listen, even though politically we disagree on issue of unification, on issue of whether Taiwan is a part of China or Taiwan is a Republic of China, but you have all come such a hard way, and now you're the citizens of the Republic of China, that is Taiwan. So he goes there, I think, as a gesture to unite the nation. And I think that's really is the most important. And I think he's done a wonderful job.
Well, and while he was there, he stated that no external force can change the future of Taiwan. Those are not small words and very symbolic for where he gave them, where he was commemorating them, and what they mean in a very hot time between China and Taiwan. Could we see a second Battle of guningtou in the near future?
Well, I think, guningtou obviously will be regarded as a precursor to the invasion of Taiwan. Now, this this Quemoy Island, as I say, is just a few kilometers. At the closest one, I think 2 miles away.
It's 6 miles from China.
Yeah, well, at the closest one is very close. You can swim there.
Hey, now you're using kilometers. Look at you.
I know.
I used them the other week, and you were ripping me for it. Now you're using kilometers.
I just try to be intercontinental as you are. So.
Oh yeah. Now you can. Okay.
So I think it's. Let me put it this way: Chinese military strength obviously has grown so much. Is Chinese People's Liberation Army is not the one that is 74 years ago. So their amphibious capability has grown, but I think this also give us some lessons to learn from. The Chinese amphibious warfare capability have increased, but also they have some weaknesses and vulnerabilities in that kind of area. There could be another battle of guningtou. I think if we do it right, if we learn the right lessons from the October 1949 Battle of Quemoy, and I think we could prevail again.
Well, just from a logistical perspective, that being the precursor for the invasion, what do the defenses look like right now in the island of Quemoy?
I think
like what is the defense presence of Taiwan on that island right now?
I don't think there is any dramatic increase, but there is no dramatic decrease either, because it's very sensitive there. You don't want to be unnecessarily provocative,
right?
And, Quemoy is known for a lot of things, for its geographic sensitivity. In a certain way, Quemoy is very much like a West Berlin in Asia, because that was the place where the Chinese Communist Mao Zedong launched a blitzkrieg on October 23rd, 1958. He shelled that place to no end. Millions of shells were fired in the subsequent months and years against that tiny island held by Taiwan. So it was basically a hotspot of the Cold War. Almost brought the United States into a nuclear confrontation with China at the time, because it was during the Eisenhower administration. The U.S. Joint Chief of Staff actually had a pretty specific plan to respond to that. Which had the Battle of Quemoy, actually the Quemoy crisis, which is known as the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis of 1958, exerted enormous impact upon American politics as well. 2 years later, in 1960, during the presidential election between Richard Nixon and Kennedy, they had the famous TV debates. There were 4 of them. The last debate was devoted to security issue. The number one issue, the most contested issue, was about the defense of Quemoy Island, Quemoy and Matsu. And so this is really a big deal. Of course, people who watch those debates do not remember the contents of that, substance of that. They care about Kennedy's hair and Nixon's facial expression. So what I'm saying is the Quemoy is very important. So it's not really that heavily defended. But as I say, go back to my earlier point, Quemoy is known for 2 things. One is Quemoy has this very international renowned kitchen knife, which is their cleaver, almost like, the Chinese, the chopping board use that. And that's mostly made of the Chinese shells. All the heads.
Really?
Warhead that didn't really explode. So they use the steel to forge the kitchen cleaver, which is a very famous. In Taiwan.
I'm looking at them. Artillery steel Chinese cleavers. Wow,
that's exactly right, and a lot of them. Another thing that Quemoy is famous for, because a lot of soldiers were stationed there. They're kind of away for so long. What's the best way to wash away your woes, your melancholy? Alcohol. So they made this really potent lighter fluid called Kinmen Gaoliang, which is basically it's like a vodka-like hot liquor from Quemoy.
Okay.
So I hope if you go to Quemoy someday, hopefully with me, and we'll get something back.
欢迎来到6度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具， 加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。